Arrays, just like any other variable type, can be passed in as arguments to functions. They can also be returned as return types. Say, for example, we want to create a function that calculates the average student marks from an array of student marks. Let's name our function calculateAverage. This will take in an input of an array of doubles, and it would return a single double, which is the average value of all the doubles in the input array. Our function definition would look something like this: public double calculateAverage, and the parameter of an array of double just called student marks. The first thing we need to do is figure out how many student marks values are stored inside this array. Because that is passed as a parameter, we don't really know how many elements are stored in it. To figure that out, we could simply type in the array name followed by the keyword length. This basically counts the number of items inside that array and stores it into our variable size. Next, to calculate the average, we need to add up all the items inside the array first. We can do that by declaring this total variable of type double and initialize it to 0, and then we follow that with a loop. Our loop counter index starts from 0 and keeps going as long as index is less than size, which we have calculated earlier. Now inside that loop, we could continue to add to our total variable with the student marks of index. Notice how I have used the loop counter as our index in our array here. This is basically because our loop counter starts from 0 and keeps incrementing by 1 every time, which means using this inside the loop, we are accessing every single item in the student marks array. And because we are adding it to our total variable, by the end of this loop, total would have the total sum of the values inside the student marks array. To calculate the average then, we just need to divide that by our total size, which is the number of elements inside the array. Then we could safely return our average calculation as a result of our function. That looks great. Let's trace it with an example array of doubles to see if it actually works. If student marks was equal to this array here with those 4 different marks, then once we start calculating the length, it would set our size to 4 because we have 4 different values here. The next step is to initialize total to 0, and then we step into the loop. Let's draw this table here and keep track of our loop counter, what's it accessing inside the array, and the updated total value every step. The first thing that happens is initializing index to 0, so index becomes 0. And because index is less than size, which is 4 in this case, we step inside the loop and run this statement here. What happens inside the loop is we are trying to access student marks of index. Index is 0 at this case, so we are trying to access student marks of 0, which is the first item in the array, which is equal to 75. Once we get that value, we add that to our total variable because we are using the plus equal signs here, and total was initialized to 0. So once we add 75 to 0, total becomes 75. And then we reach the closing brackets of our for loop, so we go back up and increment index. Once we run the increment index instruction, index increases by 1 from 0 to 1. The next thing that happens is we check if index is less than size. Index is 1 and size is 4, so means we are allowed to step inside the loop. Inside our loop, we are accessing student mark of index, which is now 1, and student marks of 1 is equal to 73. In that case, we are accessing 73, and then we are adding this student marks of index to total variable using this plus equal sign. So we are basically adding 73 to 75, and total gets updated to 148. Again, we reach the closing brackets, so we go back up, increment index by 1, making it from 1 to 2, and then we go back and check if index is less than size. size is 4, so that's still true, so we step inside the loop again. Student marks of index at that point is 2, so we get 72, and then we are adding that to our total. We have updated total from 148 to 220. We reach the closing bracket, go back up, increment index from 2 to 3, and then we are comparing it with the size, and 3 is still less than 4, so we step inside our loop, accessing our student marks of 3, which is 80 at that point, and add that to total, making it from 220 to 300. Then at the last iteration, once we get this closing bracket, we go back up increment index and making it 4. But now 4 is no longer less than size, so we do not step into that loop, and we basically just jump all the way down to the closing bracket. Now that we are done with the loop, we calculate the average by dividing total with size. Total ended up being 300 and size started as 4. So we divide 300 by 4, which becomes 75, and that's the value that gets stored into our variable average. So now we can safely return that as a result of the function. Knowing the size of the array is very handy in many occasions. We have seen how to use it as an upper limit in the loop, but there's more serious problem that could happen if you just ignore the size of your array. Imagine we are accessing different numbers in this array here. We know that it has 4 numbers in it, which means the indices start from 0 all the way with 3. And we have already seen how we can detect the number of items in an array using the length keyword. If we run this statement here on this array, then length would actually calculate there are to be 4 items and size becomes 4. But say we ignore this size variable and try to access the item with index 6, which obviously doesn't exist in the array. Once you try to run this program, Java would throw an error saying that this index is beyond the bounds of the array. But since we have this variable size now, we know how many items exist in the array, and adding something as simple as this if condition around this print line statement, we can check if the number of index that we are trying to access is indeed smaller than our size. In this case, if the condition would evaluate to false, then it would not run the statement at all. However, if another array had more than 6 items, then this if condition would actually evaluate to true, and the statement would print the 6th item normally. Always be aware of your array bounds. The first thing you should do when dealing with arrays is to figure out how many items are in there, and always check before accessing any item if it's within the bounds of an array or not.